Well, as I said, we've just come to the end of the book of Genesis, and the book of Genesis is taken from the very first word in Genesis, in the beginning, the beginnings, the beginnings. And we try to see what the beginnings really were all about. Now we come to the leavings. Leaving? Yes, the children of Israel had moved down into Egypt, and they'd taken up their place in Goshen, which is a good place for their flocks. Joseph had been the prime minister of Egypt, but of course Joseph died. But the pharaohs that came after him remembered Joseph and remembered they had a good relationship with these people who had come down from Canaan. But then God has a plan, and this plan is still working out, because he wants these people back in Canaan. That is the place he promised to Abram. Not here in Egypt. He wants them back in Canaan. Now, would they want to move? No, I expect they wouldn't. They'd been down in Egypt now for several hundreds of years. Generation after generation had passed, and they were still in Egypt. They'd established their homes, they'd established their communities, they'd established their society. They were quite happy to be down there in Egypt. God has to turn them around and send them back to Canaan. And how does he do it? Well, we are told simply that a new dynasty of pharaohs came to the throne. A dynasty which did not know Joseph, it says. In other words, it was either a different branch of the family or perhaps even a completely different dynasty that had taken over the rule in Egypt. And they looked at these children of Israel living now in Egypt, and they realized that they were loyal to the previous dynasty, and they were growing in numbers. So they had to do something about it. And they decided that they were no longer going to allow them to live a life in this country, doing their own thing and just growing in numbers. They were going to turn them into a slave race. They were going to make their lives difficult. Because, you see, God wanted to take their eyes off where they were and direct them back again to Canaan, the land in which he was going to bless them. You know, many people ask today, why is there a growth in anti-Semitism throughout the world? And I've had a feeling that God is allowing this as well, because he wants to take his people who have scattered through the world and turn them back again to the land of Israel and bring them home to where he wants them to be. He needs them to come back. But of course, they've established themselves. You know, it was said in Europe in the 1930s that the Jewish people said, oh yes, I'm German first and I'm Jewish second. But German, I'm a loyal German citizen. I just happen to have a religion called Judaism. Then along comes Adolf Hitler and the Third Reich, and they say, no, you're Jews, and you're no longer citizens of this country, and we're going to kill you, and we're going to wipe you out, and we're going to destroy you. It came as a great cultural shock. And after the war, suddenly they realized that they could no longer depend upon the fact that they were French first and Jewish second, or German first and Jewish second, or Russian first and Jewish second. They began to realize that they were Jewish first who happened to be living in these different nations. And of course, God once again, through a great political upheaval that nobody was expecting, allowed the nation of Israel to come into being. And in 1948, Ben-Gurion, the prime minister, stands up and says, on this day, according to the decision of the United Nations, the nation of Israel has come back into being. It was a small, inadequate, impoverished nation, but it had come back into being. The countries around it said, this can't be, we're going to try and destroy it. But over and over again, we see God blessing that nation as it's grown stronger and stronger. And from all over the world, there are now more Jews living in Israel than throughout the world. And even those living in other countries are having to face up to the problems of anti-Semitism. the leavings. Just like the Exodus in Egypt, the leavings. Because when the Jews there were made into a slave race, suddenly their lives became difficult. Suddenly they had these problems. And suddenly they started looking into the scriptures again and realizing that God was calling them to go back out of Egypt and back towards the land that he promised to Abram. They were not to stay here any longer. And so they began to call upon the Lord, and they had to ask him, how are we going to get out of this place? They'd come down, just a few, 84 people altogether, into the land. By the time they actually left, they numbered about 3 million. The numbers had grown over and over. They become quite a powerful nation. They came down as a family. They were going to be called out as a nation. They were going to move back out again, this vast number of people. God's plan was going to be fulfilled. He had to get them out of Egypt. He had to get them back looking towards Canaan. So the first thing he does is that he makes their life unpleasant for them where they are, so that their focus will change from Egypt back to the promised land of Canaan. Amen.